Welcome everybody to our Leadership Collective session. It is so fun. I know there's some of you guys over there. Finish grabbing your coffee, your snacks, whatever it is that you want, and then just come on in. But during this session, we are going to be talking about mental health and how to respond as leaders, how to respond as somebody who, because some of you might be in different roles in this room, how to respond as a parent, how to respond as just somebody who has an adolescent, a teenager in their life. And so I'm so excited to have these wonderful ladies up here with me. And so I'm going to give them a moment to just let them tell you about themselves, tell you their names and who they are. So Jillian, do you want to kick us off?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jillian Pancher. I'm on staff at Faith Family Church in Canton, Ohio. And my husband and I are campus pastors. We started out in student ministry, and then we launched our first campus for Faith Family. It'll be 5 years in October. So that was exciting. And then Josh and I have been married for 16 years next month. And we have 2 little boys who are 7 and 10.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kelley Streib, and before I tell you who I am, I just want to say thank you to Pastor Alyssa and Pastor Ben, because I had a moment in my life where I was searching for where God wanted to put me, and he said, go into the youth program. And I said, no, I think I misunderstood you. Could you repeat that? And let me tell you something. Working under their leadership has been a time of spiritual growth, leadership growth, and they are just absolutely awesome pastors. And I just want to honor you for that and thank you for that. And of course, I love Pastor John and Michelle as well, and I know that you are right in line with him. But just if you haven't had a chance, if you're not the lead youth pastor, just make sure you tell them how much that they mean to you. And if you are the lead pastor, know you are impacting your leaders in their growth just as much as you're impacting your students. During the day, I am a judge at the Court of Common Pleas in Butler County, which means I'm a trial court judge. And I've spent a lot of years, over 15, dealing with abused and neglected children. And so in that, I am not an expert in mental health, but I certainly have had a fair bit of training and experience. I still currently work there. My husband of 34 years, and I have 2 daughters, and we are members here at Victory Family Church.
Yes, and so this is going to be a really good discussion. And just to give you guys a little bit more background about Ben and I, we have 3 kiddos. We have a 6-year-old, 4-year-old, and a 1-year-old. And so my husband, he is full-time here at the church as one of our campus pastors and also the next-gen pastor. And I primarily stay home and homeschool our kiddos, but I do work one day as a therapist. And so I'm excited for this conversation because I love talking all things mental health. But I just want to jump in and get started with this topic and this wonderful discussion we're about to have. Because as we know, mental health, if you've been working with youth for any amount of time, you know how big of a topic that this is. I know on Wednesday night in prayer, almost everybody who came up to me was coming up to me because they were struggling with anxiety. I had so many kids come up, and that was the big thing. And so we see this so prevalent in our culture. And so I wanted to ask you guys, how have you seen it affect our youth? And why is it important for us as church leaders, as pastors, to be trained in this area?
Absolutely. I think it's more rampant than it's ever been. We started back in student ministry 11, 12 years ago in junior high, which was it was just kind of when social media was kicking off. And I mean, we had students that were struggling with things, but it felt like as social media and phones were getting more prevalent, just issues were starting to come more to the surface. And so I think when you combine an already awkward stage of adolescence and everything that students are navigating in schools and at home, and then you add the social media piece, you just see more and more issues come to the surface. And I think social media can be a really good tool, but doesn't the enemy like to take things that are good and use them for bad? And I've seen it even in my own life. Isn't it like so true that when maybe there's an area that you're insecure about, isn't it funny when you get on social media and you just start scrolling? It's like it can read your mind and pops up all your insecurities right on this little device in front of you. Maybe you feel like you're not skinny enough, and then it's like you see all these fitness accounts. Or maybe you don't feel like your house is the nicest house, so then it's like all these home accounts start coming up. And so I see that even in students' lives with the things that they're dealing with, and it's like those things are just constantly in front of them, and seeing they're so young to start to navigate all of that.
I completely agree, and so does the United States Surgeon General. Some of you may have heard, but the Surgeon General is now asking Congress to place warning labels on certain social media and phone apps because the statistics are in. Our kids are being impacted, and often not in a positive way, through their social media. While that by no means is the only source of their anxiety, it certainly has increased. What I would want you to know of why it is important for you to know about it is mental health, and especially anxiety and depression, falls on a spectrum. You know, we've got our kids, who hasn't been there? I'm worried about, am I going to get invited to the dance by anybody, or maybe by that special someone I want to be invited to? Am I going to do okay to get on a team or pass a test? That's typical adolescent anxiety, and I'm not placing that at a low, but that's on one spectrum. The other side of the spectrum are kids who have chemical imbalances, and they have some brain impulses that are not working as God intended them to work. And so how you deal with a student who is suffering from anxiety or depression is you need to locate them. So you've probably heard about locating the kid for spiritual growth and how to speak to them. Do the same thing for your students. As you're engaging with them, start locating where does their anxiety and depression fall on that spectrum. And that will help you then to know better how to address their issues and when you need to involve parents. And I'm sure we're going to talk about that more.
Yeah, I think that's so good. And I think something else, too, is I don't know what everybody's role is in your church, but oftentimes the church in general, we are the front line for people. There is just something about being a Christian, being a church leader, where people will just naturally feel comfortable telling you things. And so students who maybe have never met you before, they might become vulnerable with you because they just want somebody to open up to. And so a lot of times you're going to get those topics like suicide, abuse, depression, all of the big things, and they're just going to spill it out on you, and we need to be ready for whenever that spilling happens. As a therapist, I can't tell you how many times I work primarily with adults, but I can't tell you how many times I've had adults come into my office and say that I was not the first person that they went to, but they started with their church, and they went to a leader or a pastor, and the pastor didn't hear them well. And it's not that they turned them away or was like, oh, they minimized their problem. It was they tried to help them, but because they were not equipped to handle it, their lack of training ended up hurting that person, when I know that that was not the pastor's heart, and I know that that was not the intent. But unfortunately, because they were not equipped, because they were not trained, they ended up causing more damage instead of being that person that could have been a great sounding board. And so I wanted to ask you, ladies, what have been some best practices that have helped you when talking with somebody who struggles with their mental health? What are like the things that are like a good go-to for you?
In my context, being on church staff, being in full-time ministry, for us, it's really important to be under the covering of our lead pastors and to follow the protocol that they would ask us to follow as staff members. So I think it's really important that if you're not the lead pastor in here, that you check with your lead pastor and make sure that you're following what they would want as you're under their covering. And so for us in our context, we have a too deep rule. So we would never meet with a minor or a student without another adult present. And that protects you as a leader, and that protects the student, so that they can't accuse you of anything and vice versa. And so that's just a policy that we have with our church. And we're very clear about who we are and who we aren't. We are pastors, so we can provide biblical encouragement. We can pray with you. We can encourage you with scriptures, but we are not trained therapists. And so we really feel like we can hear you, we can pray, we can encourage, but we want you to go see a professional that can help you navigate this. So we're not going to try to pretend to be someone that we're not, because we end up harming students more than helping them. And we also really encourage when we talk to students, I know Pastor Bubba touched on this, but we say, we are going to include your parents in this conversation when we're talking with minors. And so we feel that it's important that we're ministering to the whole family unit, not just the student.
Yeah, I love every bit of that. And, you know, not only what you say, but how you say it matters. And it also depends on, are you in the middle of a crisis? Or is this a discussion that comes up in a small group maybe, or a one-on-one? So one of the tips that I have learned, and I have found it to be very, very helpful, is to change your but statements to and statements. Have you guys learned that? Okay, so here's a couple examples. I see you're upset about being left out of the group. And it's okay to feel that way. What you don't want to say is, I see you're upset about being left out, but you shouldn't let it ruin your day. That is, I'm not listening to your feelings and creating a relational conversation. I'm trying to dismiss it, even though that may not be your intent. I'll give you another example. You might say, because maybe you're struggling with some anxiety, I'm not feeling great about myself right now. You could say, but maybe if I'm just good enough, I'll feel better about myself. What you should be saying to yourself is, I'm not feeling real great about myself right now, and I know that my feelings do not define my worth. So it works for you, and it works for your student. Always validate their feelings, and follow it up with something that will help them move to that next step.
Yeah, and I'm hearing you, Kelley, say that, again, the validation, but you're also seeing the person, and you're also empathizing with them. Empathy is such a huge thing. I've been working on this with Ben. If you're married in this room, you know that being married to a man, they're not always the most empathetic. So I've been working with this on Ben. But empathy is putting yourself in somebody else's shoes. What I teach people, because when I'm here at the church, I'm not wearing my therapist hat, I'm a pastor. And so I'm walking more in the pastor role, but with my therapy skills. But what I teach people here, to make it so simple, do not try to fix the problem. And I know that sounds really crazy, but whatever they're bringing you, it's probably really big, and you're not going to fix it in a 30-minute conversation. And we also have to remember, we are not the Savior, ever. We are not the Savior. We point them to the Savior. And so when somebody comes to you with a problem, because it's going to happen, I'm sure it's already happened, your biggest thing is to sit with them in their pain. And that's a hard thing to do, and people are uncomfortable with it. So oftentimes we try to, okay, well, here's the answer, A, B, and C. Okay, yeah, read your Bible, bye. Because we don't want to sit in their hurt because we're uncomfortable with their pain. And so we often end up dismissing that student, that person, because it's our own insecurities and it's our own issues. But we need to learn to sit with people. And what you guys are saying is it's being present with them in that moment. You're not thinking about how to fix it or anything like that, but you're just being with them. What were you going to say, Kelley?
I was going to say, one of the things I struggled with for a long time was, how do I validate their feelings, but not necessarily accept the premise under it?
Yeah.
Especially dealing with certain topics. And there is a difference between validation and acceptance. You can validate how someone is feeling and help, like you said, sometimes very uncomfortable for us, but help them walk through that feeling in the moment. But you don't have to accept their underlying fact of why they're feeling that way.
Yeah.
And that's really helped me to not get into the nitty-gritty of things that really I'm not trained to get into the middle of.
Yeah, but I think what you're saying is being able to point out the lie that they're believing, which I think that we all in here can say, like, oh, that's the enemy that is doing that to your mind. That's culture that's saying that. So 2 things you guys can do simply and practically is, one, when you want to connect with that person, and that happens through empathy, validation, being present with them. I tell people this all the time. If you listen well, you can help well. The biggest thing I was trained in as a therapist is to listen differently. So when I hear people talk, and if I'm really tuned in, I will hear all kinds of other things that maybe somebody who isn't trained as a therapist might not hear. But if you listen well, then you can help well. Yeah. If you miss what the actual problem is, you're going to mishelp them. You're going to give them the wrong solution, and you're not actually going to be helping them. So you want to connect with them, listen. You want to talk 20%, they talk 80%. And then the second thing that you can do that's very easy is you want to connect them to their next steps. Maybe that is seeing a professional therapist. Maybe that's a resource in your church. Maybe our church offers spiritual guidance. It's like a couple sessions with a pastor. And then you want to connect them with the Savior, because he can speak to them in one moment, and that issue they're facing can disappear like that. So put your pastor hat on. How can I disciple this person to be closer to Jesus? What do they need to do? Maybe they need to be saved. Maybe they need to get a devotional life. Whatever it might be. Maybe like it's a small group in your church you think would be great. We have Freedom here. That's a great next step that I always push people to. But with that, so those are some things that you guys can do. What are some things that you shouldn't do? What are like some things that maybe you've seen people do, or you've been around people that you're like, okay, this is a big no-no when I'm in that helper situation?
When I was thinking about this question, I was just thinking about back when Josh and I were youth pastors, and we were training youth leaders, so volunteers that reported to us. And one of the big things that we saw was that they would be following the 2 Deep rule, and they would have their connect group, and then a student would confide in them something like, I have an eating disorder, or I'm dealing with suicidal thoughts. And so they would keep that between the leader and themselves. And then maybe a month would go by, and they would tell us in the hallway, oh, somebody in our group is dealing with this issue. And so we're like, okay, we need to train our leaders not to sit on information like that. If you feel like a student is dealing with someone, go to your youth pastor, or if you're the youth pastor, go to your senior leader and say, we're navigating this situation with someone. Don't just sit on that information.
Can I jump into that really quick, Jillian? Because that's happened to Ben and I before too. And you want to help if you're not the pastor in that area, you want to help your pastor to pastor. They are responsible for that flock. They are responsible for those kiddos, and they cannot properly do it if you withhold from them. Nothing is confidential going up. Yeah. You cannot keep secrets, and so you are there to aid them in pastoring those sheep. And so think about it like that. I am here to help you to pastor.
Yeah, that's really good. And going along with what you had said, don't try to be the hero in the story. Jesus is the hero, and we're here to help students families navigate these issues. We're not trying to be like, oh, I helped this student through this. We're just a tool that God is using. We're not trying to be the hero. And so I think just helping students, okay, if you don't call you need to tell your mom, I'm going to follow up with you tomorrow. Okay, did you, now I'm going to follow up with the family. Did you guys set up a counseling appointment? Walking them through, not just saying, here's your next step, but actually pastoring the family and the situation. Yeah.
So I agree, obviously, with everything that you wise women have just said. And going back to your words matter, I want to talk to those of you who maybe you've not really experienced this yet. You're newer to ministry. Having certain awareness of words can be very, very important to help you. We want to pray over our students. We want to pray for our students. We want to stand with them for their healing. In the midst of that, again, first locating where that student is, there's just certain things that are better to say than others, because the goal is for them to come back to you. Right? What we don't want to have happen is you say something and they leave, and one of 2 things is going to happen. They're either going to turn you off because their parents make them come to youth ministry, and they're not going to hear anything that you're saying about anything, or they're going to stop coming. So I have a real quick this, not that kind of idea. So these are very practical, but it's just to get your mindset in the right place. Some kids, when you locate them spiritually, you're going to be able to dig right into that, that hard stuff. But these are for the kids that maybe they're not quite there yet. So here's some things when you're dealing with anxiety not to say. You need to relax and calm down, especially if they're having a panic attack, because they can't relax and calm down. Stop being so dramatic. You're worrying too much. Maybe they need to work on worry from a biblical standpoint, but when they're in it, when you're in the crisis, telling them that doesn't help. How are you not over that yet? I have seen youth, we pray for healing. It's not manifested right away, and they come, well, why aren't you over that? We prayed. You just got to stand firm. And it took every ounce that they had to walk in the church doors that night, right? So we need to love them. Okay, here's some things you can say. I want you to know I support you. Now, keeping that in our biblical line of what your church stands for, that's not going to always be appropriate, okay? But you support them in their recovery. You support them in their walk. That's what that means. So I don't want that to be misconstrued.
And nothing like LGBTQ stuff, just to be clear.
I'm not supporting you in that sex change. That is not what I'm talking about, okay? And then let's see. I hear and believe your struggle. I hear you, and I believe you're struggling. I may not understand what you're going through, but I really want to. How can I help? What do you want to tell me? And I'm not judging you. You can open up and tell me, because I'm not going to judge you. Now, can I be on my soapbox for half a second? Okay, so my soapbox is that there are some phrases, guys, I just gave you some good phrases to say, but there are some phrases that our students hear differently than we hear. And if you're dealing with someone who comes from a trauma, so this could be a physical abuse, a sexual abuse, or some other form of trauma, some things that we would say that feel positive, they're going to hear bad. And in fact, some of those things would be exactly what their abuser uses to manipulate them. So again, know who you're talking to as best you can. So I want to give you some examples because this is a smaller group of people, but you need to be aware of it. Try to be positive. This too will pass. Be grateful it's not worse. Okay, those are things that a lot of times the abuser might say to them. Just try to be positive about it. Don't worry about it. This is normal. So just think about some of those phrases before you use them. And a suggestion could be that you could say, depending on the situation, is, I get what you're saying, and just know that your discomfort or your fill in the blank does not have to last forever. And then again, move them on. But just be aware of those contexts, especially if you're dealing with kids who may be coming from abusive or traumatic situations, and if they're self-harming. You have to be very, very careful with what you're saying with kids who may be self-harming.
And to go back to what you were saying, Kelley, it sounded like you were saying about not just hitting them with all truth. A lot of times, yes, the Bible is so powerful, but people will not hear you well if you don't deliver it in the right way with the right spirit and the right attitude. And so when you're talking to somebody who's going through something, it's about grace and truth and speaking to them in love, but also giving them truth too, because that's what will set you free. But it's about the right timing. And so Ben and I, we always say you go from being face-to-face with somebody and having a conversation to walking arm in arm with somebody. So you go from them telling you things to, I'm going to journey through this with you. And on that journey, I will have more opportunity to speak truth into your life because it comes out of relationship. Another thing that you don't want to do is people aren't always aware of this, is your body language and your facial expressions. Something so simple, but when I'm talking to people especially, I can read people's facial expressions all the time, and you're always communicating something. Every one of you, I could go around the room right now and tell you what your body language and your facial expression is communicating to me right now. So be aware, when I'm meeting with somebody as a helper, as a pastor, what am I communicating to you without even verbalizing it? What is my face saying to you? What is my body posture saying? Is my phone out? Am I looking at my watch? What am I communicating? Are my arms crossed? Do I have a mean mug on my face? Do I have resting face? Like, what is going on in my body? All of this communicates something, and I forget the percentage. Is it like 85% or what's like 75? It's a really high percentage of things are communicated non-verbally. So you could be saying all the right things, but if you're looking at somebody like this, or if you have the wrong tone, you could totally be missing it. And the other thing is, don't rush. Guys, this is going to be harder for you because you are natural fixers, which is how God designed you. And you'll fix it, but just take your time with that person and don't think that you have to check that checkmark box off. So we wanted to talk about the scary topics, suicide and abuse, those types of things. And so I wanted to ask you ladies, what are your church's protocols on that? Again, like Jillian said, check with your senior pastor. These are just our protocols that we have to kind of give you a gauge if you're like, I don't know what to do with this. This is just to kind of give you something to kind of feed off of if you do need a protocol. But I just wanted to share those, if we could share those with us.
So specifically with suicide, if we have a student who's saying that they're dealing with that, we would notify our direct report is our lead pastor, so we would notify them of the situation. We would get parents or whoever the guardian is involved right away. And for Josh and I personally, when we were in high school and we were dating, Josh's older brother committed suicide. And so for us, this is a very personable, situation that we navigated as high school students, where his brother did not get help soon enough. He had an appointment for a few days later, and he didn't make it to his appointment to get help. So we are very on the front end of this. Like, we take this seriously. We're going to notify the right people. We're going to get you help because we personally lived through someone who didn't get help in time. So for suicide, for abuse, we have a responsibility to call CPS. It's not our job as pastors to navigate if this, what they're saying is true or not. We have a responsibility to call and let them handle that situation and determine if it's abuse or not. So that's our protocol at Faith Family.
Yeah, so I can jump in here. So Kelley and I go to the same church. Okay, so for suicide, how we handle this is very similar. When we have that conversation, we always ask the questions, and I'm blanking right now. I should have had this prepared, but we always ask, like, if there's a plan, what their plan is, and if there's any intent in that. So again, we are not, even though like I can assess some things as a therapist, we are not the ones to make that call, but it is just kind of information gathering. Whenever I'm having a conversation with somebody, it is all about getting information into your hands, especially abuse, because you're going to need to report those details. So we're getting all that information. Now, if you are physically with me and I feel like you are not safe to leave, I can't keep you because that's called kidnapping. But I would call the authorities at that point. You are not mandated to report anything with suicide. As crazy as that sounds, you're not mandated, but who can let a child walk out of your church knowing that they're struggling? But if they are struggling and there is like a plan and there is intent, then I am calling the police at that point and mom and dad. We have never thankfully had that situation, but that is how we would handle it. Now, how we handle, a lot of times it is suicidal thoughts. I'm sure you guys have heard this. Kids will say things like, oh, I don't want to live anymore. I don't want to be here anymore. I don't want to deal with this anymore. And when you have the conversation, it's really, I just don't want to be in pain anymore. I don't actually want to kill myself. We do have them call mom and dad, or we say, do you want to call mom and dad, or do you want me to call mom and dad? And so one of us is calling mom and dad. Now, we have had the scenario, because we have our youth group on Wednesday night. We have had the scenario where everybody's home. It's 11 o'clock at night. We have a leader text us, hey, so-and-so told me this in group today. Just wanted to let you know. Okay. Did you call mom and dad? No. Okay, get their number. You're calling mom and dad. And it's 11:30 at night. I am not going to bed unless we have told mom and dad, because I will not be able to live with myself if something happens to them and we had that information and sat on it. I'm sorry I'm waking mom and dad up. I don't care. I care more about that student's well-being, as extreme as that seems. Like we have not gone to bed and we are waiting to get a hold of mom and dad. And that's our protocol here. Like, we pass it off to mom and dad immediately. There is no waiting. Even if it doesn't seem like it's an emergency, I'm not going to assess that. I'm going to put that in mom and dad's hands because, I'm going to pass that off to them. Now, whenever it comes to abuse, obviously we are all mandated reporters. If you are not the one that is being told about the abuse, your leader has to be the one that reports the abuse. Okay, so there's a couple situations here that we have walked through. A student comes to you, because we also oversee middle school, and this is something that's never happened, but this is how we would handle it. Student gets dropped off, tell us they're being abused by parent who just dropped them off. I am calling the police immediately. I do not want you to go home with them. Again, I can't hold you, but I'm calling the police immediately because I'm releasing you back into the offender's hands. Yeah. That's what I'm doing. I'm not childlining. I'm calling the police right away. That's usually not the case. It's usually kids come to us. They're with mom or dad only on the weekend, and they tell us about the primary parent that they're with is the abuser, or it's an uncle. Okay, so I'm childlining that. I'm putting in that report. But before I do that, when they are going to be picked up, I'm waiting with them for mom and dad, and I have a conversation with mom and dad. And I say, this is what came out today. I want you to know I'm calling Childline as soon as you guys leave here. So CYS will be calling you. I give the parents a heads up, because who wants CYS knocking at their door? That's kind of like my courtesy to them. Again, this is not the potential offender. This is the non-offending parent or non-offending guardian, if that makes any sense. I do that as a therapist. If a child opens up to me in session and mom's bringing me and it was about dad, I tell mom, hey, little Susie opened up. I just want you to know, because you should know as a parent, because you have to parent your child, but also know that CYS is probably going to be calling you today. And so you said CPS because Jillian's from Ohio, so I know some of us are from different states, but in Pennsylvania, we have CYS and we use Childline. And then just in general, aside from like suicide and abuse, how do you guys involve parents in a child's mental health journey?
We are very much involving the family unit as a church. Like you said, calling the parents ourselves. I don't know how many times that Josh and I have had to have the awkward conversation, because a lot of times in our situations, the parents are blindsided. Oh, we didn't even know. We didn't have any idea. And so for us, we've just had to look at it like this is an opportunity to pastor the whole family and to be there for the parents as they're walking through this and for the child. So I just think making sure that you're prayed up and just being ready to navigate that with the parents as well.
I'm going to say two things. One, the abuser is not always a parent. So one of the areas that we're seeing growing are students being potential victims online. In fact, at one of our youth camps a few years ago, we had a sixth grader open up to us that someone had coerced her into sending inappropriate pictures of herself, and they were basically blackmailing her, and finally she opened up. So we did have to notify mom and dad and have those conversations. We also notified the police for that reason. But kids don't always tell their parents the truth. They tell them what they want their parents to hear. So as you continue to minister with them and walk alongside with those parents, sometimes you'll have a parent that's going to come to you and say, well, my daughter or my son, when they got home, they told me blah, blah, blah. Or they told me it really wasn't true what they told you. That is because our innate desire is to please our parent. So just be aware that as you're having those conversations, that there may be some factual inconsistencies that doesn't mean, until something has been investigated perhaps, that the child is not telling the truth, and then follow your church's protocol on that. And lastly, could I give a few statistics on suicide? Just because one thing I learned, and I did not know this, maybe you could address this. I thought if someone was going to kill themselves that they were going to be really sad in the moment. But we had a teen suicide through work, and the girl went out with her family. They went to see a movie. They had dinner. They came home. It was nice tuck-ins. And unfortunately, their daughter killed herself in the middle of the night. So just being aware of those biases, sometimes they're not accurate. But according to the Center for Disease Control, suicide is the third leading cause of death for youth. Ages 10 to 14, it is the second leading cause for their death. And boys are 4 times more likely to actually commit suicide. Girls are more likely to attempt it. So we need to take these things very, very seriously. And of course, with abuse, I think you guys, I have nothing else to add to that unless you have a question for me. So thanks.
No, I just wanted to add a little bit with the parent thing. If it's something that's not like abuse or more of a crisis, I do ask that the student's parent calls me the next day to confirm that they did in fact talk with their parent and that they didn't just say, oh yeah, I talked to mom, but just so that we are on the same page. But thank you, ladies, so much.
Can I add one more
Yes,
thing? Sorry.
yes, no.
I just want to encourage you that this can feel like a very overwhelming thing. I know when Josh and I have walked through things with students and families, you can get anxiety about helping somebody with anxiety, and I've been there. But I think it's really underrated that we don't talk about it enough to be prayed up in the Holy Spirit. And I can't tell you how many times I have been in worship or praying, and God has dropped a name or a family, and I'm like, okay, God, something must be coming. And so I'll start to begin to pray for that family, for that situation, and God will just start to drop things in my spirit. And then, sure, a week will go by, and that student will come and say, I've been going through this. And it's like, I've already been prayed up about this situation, and so God's already dropped things to share. And so I just want to encourage you, be praying for your students, be praying for your families. Now that we're in a campus context, I'm praying for the people at campus, praying that God would give me a spirit of discernment, a spirit of wisdom, and God will just drop things in your spirit and just prepare the way ahead of you. So I just want to encourage you, be expecting and ask God for those things, because he's called you to ministry. So he's not just going to abandon you in the hard moments. Like, he wants to help you. So be prayed up, and the Holy Spirit is such a good helper.
Did you have any encouraging words for them, Kelley?
Very similar is that, you need to, first of all, you need to know your emotions. And especially guys, you need to be in tune with what your emotions are so that you can then help them. And you don't have to necessarily put it up, but we have a resource that maybe we can shoot out to you to help you with that. But you minister to them by the overflowing of your cup. So if your cup is full, then you can help them, because it's all relational at this point. So that's all. Thanks.
So that's good. And we're going to do a Q&A here in just one moment, but I did want to address, there are cards on your table with a QR code. So here at Victory, we do have resources of what we use to train our leaders in these topics. There's some things on suicide, abuse. I threw in a couple of trainings that I have done for leaders on how to care for people, how to have those difficult conversations about connection, different things like that. So I wanted to put that all there for you. If you guys don't have anything and you need some resources for your leaders, you can copy, take, whatever you want to do. It is yours for the keeping. But did you guys want to go ahead and do some Q&A? Those two or these two? Oh, yeah, go ahead. I forgot what they are.
Real quick, I just wanted to just answer those 3 questions about when we are talking with the student and asking them those 3 questions. Those 3 questions are how. So if they actually do you have a plan? Have you thought through this? Have you thought through the details? Do you have a plan? The second is when. So you ask them, when would you plan on doing that, and then where? Where? If they've thought through any of those details, if they can answer one of those questions, we know that's like a red alert emergency, and we are going to call mom and dad right there in that moment. And so those are just those 3 questions. Does anybody else have questions that we can? Yeah, absolutely. You guys are going to get a lot of questions. I can already tell.
Ready.
So what do you believe is a healthy line of demarcation in attempting to relate to something someone confesses in you? Because sometimes, inadvertently we can project our past experiences and think, I know exactly what you're going through. It's way off the mark. So what's like a healthy boundary to know when to try and relate, not compare necessarily, but just kind of to offer that hope of like, I kind of understand and just want you to know, like, because of Jesus, I overcame. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes total sense. And so if you guys want to jump into, I will hand it off. But I always ask myself, is this actually going to help them? And so sometimes somebody does need to relate, and it's all about discernment and just being led in that moment of like, does this student need my story right now? Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And it's just about like, if I share this with them, what is the benefit to them? And just asking yourself, is that going to help? Because, and you even said it, like sometimes people will think like, I know exactly what you're going through. I never say I know what anybody's going through, because even if we went through the same thing, how you took it and how I took it was totally different. And so I always stay away from things, but you could say things like along the lines of like, I experienced something similar, and it could be maybe a message of hope. But again, it's like, okay, how is this going to help the student in that moment? And it's just about reading the situation and knowing, again, doing this with God of like, okay, God, what do you say? Do you give me the green light, or is it like an ugh? So just kind of discerning in that moment, if that helps. Do you guys have anything to add? Okay.
Adam, we have a question over here.
So a few years ago, it may have been before our lead youth pastor was there, but we had a young man whose problems that he was experiencing and dealing with were actually potentially a threat to the members of our youth and middle school. So how do you balance and deal with a situation like that? I don't know ultimately how it was handled, but I know the young man was never at our church again. And so what do you guys do in that situation?
Okay, we did go through something very similar, so if you guys have anything to jump in on. We had a young man who had some very severe mental health issues, and it was threatening other students in our middle school ministry. So what we did is we had a meeting with mom and him and dad. Dad was in and out, but we went with them and we came up with a plan. And we tried to get them resources and try to get him help because he was in services, just because of like the extent of his struggle. But we did come up with like a plan, and I can't remember it off the top of my head. I would have to ask Ben. And our situations are probably different, but we did come up with like a safety plan almost of like, if you're gonna come in here, I know the one thing was he had to be wanted by security. Like we were at that level. And so he had to be like checked out by security was one of the things. And then there was a couple other steps that he had to have, but it was pertaining to like what the threat was and what he was going through. And so we gave him steps. Aside from the security thing, everything was pretty like mild in my opinion. But if he wanted to be in here with the students, that was what we required, because not only was our job to pastor him, but I'm here to pastor this entire flock and to protect them. And so that was what we proposed to mom, and she pretty much told us, heck with you. And they stopped coming to church here, but that was just what we had to do, because it wouldn't have been, he was somebody that like, if something really tragic would have happened and he would have been the offender, it wouldn't have been like a shock type of you know what I mean. So like it was just the things he was saying and the things he was threatening were just too scary. We could not ignore them. So it is our priority to pastor everybody and to protect everybody. But we tried to put a safety plan in place, but the family couldn't respect that. Do you guys have anything?
We've had other similar situations. I don't know the details of yours where maybe the young adult, like I'm thinking of a situation in our young adult ministry where he couldn't be in the young adult service anymore because we had to protect the flock, but he could sit in main service with his parents on a weekend. And that was a way that we could keep him in church, but also protect students. So I just think it's like a case by case. But obviously the heart is that they would stay in church, but sometimes they're not able to follow what our protocol has to be, and we have to protect the whole body.
Hello, thank you so much for sharing all your wisdom too. My question is specifically with trauma, like sexual trauma or something with a student that has brought it up to you in confidence and stuff. How do you guys handle bringing that conversation back up to check in, see how everything's going, knowing that, you know, there's a court date, there's things coming up, there's been therapy sessions. How do you bring that up without worrying about bringing up the emotions, and maybe they're not ready to talk about it again, and then you bring it up and they're stressed out about it all over again, and now you have, you know, maybe another mental health crisis right there.
Okay. So obviously, like, you never want to go into the trauma. I tell people, and even as a therapist, because I'm a trauma therapist, you shouldn't take a client where you can't bring them back from. So I've been in like conferences where they've like had them like picture things in their mind of like just things that they've gone through, and I'm just sitting there as a therapist like, why would you bring up a trauma in a group setting? Anyways, so you always want to be careful. Never bring up the trauma. Like, don't have them like relive it per se, but it's okay to ask them about it. They're gonna have emotions, and that's okay. Just be careful. Like, the only thing you want to be careful of is you're not taking them too deep anywhere. Checking in with them and just saying like, hey, how are you doing with everything is okay. If they start to go too deep, you can say, you don't have to share that with me right now, because again, they might not have the skill set to be able to come back out of that trauma, because they might be even triggering themselves in that moment. But just saying like, I'm praying for you, or how can I be praying for you for that upcoming court date? How are you processing things? Like, still be their pastor and look at it from a spiritual lens. But as for like the actual processing of the trauma, just stay away from that. That's the only thing, and just let their therapist do that part. Mm-hmm.
So if they are going to a court date, if you have a kid that's going to be going into court, it might be because of divorce, it might be because of a trauma. Check the resources in your area, because most of us now have some type of victim advocate that is trained and prepared. And I say that not for the student, but as you're engaging the parent. If the parent is showing some signs of anxiety or depression about what's happening with their student, you can ask them, what support have you gotten, both here at church, and are you getting any support at the courthouse? And if not, there are a lot of agencies out there who will provide them with free support to help them through those situations.
Awesome. Do we have any other questions?
You guys mentioned, I think mandated reporting makes it way easier for all of us. But there's a handful of those things that it's not required, with self-harm, eating disorders, suicide. How do you deal with that with the different levels of relationship within the church? Meaning, some parents we know very well and we can follow up with, and we will be on that relationship with them, that we can make sure they're responding well for that child's safety. Others, we have youth coming in that we've never even met their parents. How do you follow up, but with the mindset of protecting the child when it's not a mandated issue? So if I'm saying that they're self-harming, if I'm saying they're suicidal, I've never even met the parents, or even the stigma behind all of this, even just, especially with even guys. Like, there's 3 ladies up there, there's no men. It's such an unbalanced setup in this world with this. So how do you make sure to protect the child through that, yet foster that relationship and not over, like, you're gonna probably have to overstep boundaries at that point with the parents, because if they're not getting the help, how do I make sure I protect that child?
So the other thing as a pastor is I am here to help the parent to parent. And I need to give them all of the resources. Now, I can't force anything on anybody. I can't make anybody do anything, but I can encourage, I can give the parents all of the resources. And even if you don't have a relationship with them, well, unfortunately, that's the time that you're going to form that relationship with them. And there are definitely times where we have parents who are not engaged. But if it's like a high school student, a lot of times they can get the help that they need. But I think if it's a parent who is unengaged and they're not taking the steps, you are just continuing to check in with that student, seeing, hey, does your school offer anything? I know some schools even offer like drug and alcohol counseling, which just blows my mind because that's great. But like just like you're checking in with them and you're being a support to them. You're trying to help the student maybe to get resources. I haven't had anything that extreme where like the parent was just like, I'm not going to do anything. But like I think our biggest thing is I'm here to help the parent to parent, and I'm going to give you as much resources as I can, but I also can't control you, if that makes any sense. So helping the parent and the student as much as you can, but again, you can't force it. And as for like the stigma around it, are you worried? I'm assuming that there was concern about like how the parent would take the student and protecting the student in that standpoint. I can't. For me to come in between a parent and a student would be so not okay, because the parent is with them 24/7. They love their child. And I know as a parent, if somebody withheld something about my child to me, I would be so broken about it, because I will love my child more than any other adult will ever be able to. So we don't have to necessarily worry about that.
Good, this can't be happening.
Oh, okay, processing it like that. Okay, gotcha. I think that is whenever it becomes like you're pastoring the entire family at that point. You know, bringing them in to have a conversation, because some parents are more engaged than other parents. And so it's really great when parents are really engaged, because I bring them in, we have conversations with them. I meet with them a couple times and help them through that process. Sometimes it's just over the phone where I'm talking with the parent, but you are helping them to process, like, we're not worried about the stigma about it, but it's about the child. How can I help my child? Not thinking about the judgment attached to it, but keeping the parents' focus on their child and the well-being of their child, not on how this looks on them or anything like that. And also helping the parent with the guilt, because I'm sure that there could be guilt attached to it too, of just how could we get to this place, that type of a thing. But remembering, okay, it's not about how we got here, it's how do we get out of here type of mentality. Did you have
Just in a situation where you don't know the parents, we had a situation not too long ago where we had a student who was sending just kind of strange direct messages on social media about how they were depressed, different kind of things, then came to a service, said that they had suicidal thoughts. And so we asked our it wasn't me, it was a different staff member, asked, can we have your parents' phone number? We need to call, we need to get mom and dad involved, because we didn't know the family. This was just a student that had been invited. Well, they gave us the wrong number. They didn't give us the actual number of their mom and dad. And so they continued to send some strange messages throughout that evening, whatever. So we decided as a staff, they went to their direct report, the staff member, to call the local police to make a stop at their house, because the fake phone number, just some weird things that they were sending. And so we felt like in that situation, we have no relationship. This is the best thing that we can do to protect the student and to protect our church.
Does that answer? Okay.
Awesome. I feel like we have time for maybe one or two more questions. One over here.
Hello. As a leader, how do you mentally check in? I'm looking at this cool thing up here. Maybe just specifically for men and for women.
Yeah, and by the way, I said just because generalities, some men are not as connected into their emotions. That doesn't mean all men are. And we love you guys. And some ladies are not also, especially anybody who's gone through trauma themselves may not be as connected with their emotions. But this is an emotion wheel. This is a resource that I have used, and we can get you the information about how to get this resource if you're interested. But all of those colors are different emotions, and sometimes it's hard So a kid comes in and they're just like depressed. Depending on the situation, not in the middle of a crisis, you might want to try to define in a better word what they're feeling. But this was primarily to help you, how we've talked about you need to be full. Your cup needs to be overflowing. And obviously you're going to do that through the Holy Spirit. You're also going to do that through being more aware of what your emotions are. So that, again, some of these questions, it's perfect. So you are not putting onto someone else your experience, that you have a little bit more understanding about what you're feeling. So did that answer your question? Sure, okay.
All right, one more question back here.
Thank you guys so much. My question is, of course, we're being equipped as leaders, and we know, truth be told, their front line are each other. So what is it that you've seen or that's in place, even in having that conversation with, youth groups or, mostly older? I know it probably needs to happen maybe with the older youth, but what have you seen that's in place for that? On how to have the conversations, how to be in tune with what their friends are going through. How do you do that?
So I think that's really important. In fact, I have a 20-year-old daughter who was online about 6 months ago, and she was playing a game with some folks online, and one of the kids on there who was about 14, 15 started talking about suicide and started giving the answers to those 3 questions that Adam gave to us. And the kids that were playing, it was a small group of them, they worked together and they kept the child on the game, and they reached out and called the police for a crisis because he said he was not home, and they kept her on the phone, and he was actually hospitalized that night. So our kids need to know some of these things too, and they need to be supported. So I'll let someone else talk, but that's our kids need to be supported, and especially if there has been a suicide at a local school. We tend to see those come in groups. So teaching our kids that they can come to us if they're afraid that their friend is talking in a way that scares them. And our kids are led by the Holy Spirit too, and they know when they're seeing changes in a friend and they're worried about them. So we need to be open to those questions and give them the freedom to come to us as leaders and as parents to say, hey, we're kind of worried, and I don't want my friend to know that I told you, but I'm kind of worried, and then we can step in and do those things that we're supposed to do. But in my opinion, I'm not one of the pastors, but teaching some form of very, very simplified, support your friends, be on the lookout for this, and this is who you need to talk to if you hear them talking. And that would include abuse as well. Not just suicide, but that would be for abuse and neglect.
And then just real quick, so we don't have a system necessarily in place to teach students those skills, even though that would be a great idea. We operate off of the small group model, and this isn't a perfect system by any means, because not every student is going to open up whenever they have a friend struggling. But usually people are they're going to open up more about a friend rather than themselves. But when they do, the small group leader is the one that steps in to kind of help them to navigate that. And the way that we train our small group leaders is we have what we call it a pre-service meeting. So before the students arrive, we meet in this room and we give a 15-minute training, and it's not always on abuse and suicide and stuff like that. It's on a whole bunch of different things, but we give these quick little trainings of just of how to handle these types of things, so that if a student is struggling in, it comes up in a small group, then the small group leader is equipped to say, okay, here's these couple things that you can do to help your friend to do that. And then they can pull them aside and help them to kind of walk through that, check in with them throughout the week. Hey, how's your friend doing? Because an adult does absolutely need to know, and those types of things. But that's how we do it here with students.
Come on, guys. Hey, can we give it up for these powerful women in ministry?